Howdy folks, in front of you is the Spyderco Manix 2 Sprint Run in CPM 15V from the previous video. And it is now sporting a new high performance regrind. So I'll be going over this knife and its new specs in a little more detail. Probably in a future video I'll go over my experience working with Spyderco's 15V. And before people start asking right out of the gate, I don't typically do regrinds for people, especially on rare knives or sprint runs, unless you personally know me. And even then, that's a rarity because there's a real risk there for me as a knife maker. And that's coming from somebody who at this point, I have a few hundred regrinds under my belt. I always use extreme care so that I never overheat the blade, but I can't control the effect that the manufacturing process has done to the knife before I got it have on its final performance. So if a knife had a less than ideal heat treatment or a burnt edge, a regrind isn't going to fix that. Given that this is a golden Spyderco with a Sean Houston heat treatment, this should be an ideal candidate for a regrind, so that's why I went ahead and did it. So as for the specs of the regrind, it is 7 thou at the heel, about 8 thou for a good bit of the belly, and then it increases to 11 thou there at the tip. I always let my tips be a little bit more thick and robust than the remainder of the primary grind so that they're not as likely to snap off during use. Because I mean, look at this. This is an incredibly acute tip. It's not going to be very strong or tough, so it's going to have a limited scope of use, and you're going to have to be a very diligent user to not damage it. You know, if you chop with this, you're going to blow out the grind. This is the kind of knife that you don't hand to somebody else to use, basically. So with the regrind and everything, the angle of the primary grind is now 2.5 degrees per side. So for a majority of the edge, the factory grind was actually 4 times the thickness of this regrind. So the regrind will be a whole lot more high performance than the original factory grind. One thing I wanted to note though is that when this thing was sharpened at the factory, a lot of material was removed. In fact, the blade is actually almost 3 full millimeters shorter than other blades I have for reference. And that's just because so much material was ground away when they sharpened this. Made a little diagram to sort of show you what I'm talking about. So of course this is the ricasso. This right here is where the primary grind terminates. And there was a full 20 thou of material before you got to the apex of the edge. So 20 thou material was removed that didn't have to be removed. You know, that 20 thou material would have probably been a couple of years worth of use for me. I have a Spyderco Yojimbo 2 here for reference. So if we can see where the primary grind terminates on this and how close to that point of termination the apex of the factory edge is formed, I mean, they probably only removed a couple of thou before they were able to apex the edge. In doing it this way, you put less heat into the steel because you're not trying to hog away as much metal, and they hog away this metal fast. Now, thankfully, Spyderco, I mean, they put a lot of R&D into sharpening knives, but still, they're machine sharpening knives. It's sharpened with a robot, and it's liquid cooled while it's being sharpened, but still, when you're talking about apexes that are on the order of, 100 nanometers, it's not hard to overheat. And that brings us to the issue that I've had with the first couple of sharpenings of this. So I was using Venev resin by the diamond stones. When I got to the OCBs to finish the edge, so I stopped on the 800 grit, but I was having a really tough time with this stubborn little micro burr that would just flip from side to side to side and wouldn't break off. And that's curious because the Venev OCBs, they're not a very hard stone. In fact, they're a stone that really maximizes the abrasion to deformation ratio, kind of the opposite of a ceramic. The ceramic stone in the binder, it's so hard that, I mean, hell, you could use it like a sharpening steel and use the stone itself to realign the apex of the edge. Whereas with the Venev OCBs, not so much. You'd end up gouging the stone because they're not very hard. For me, they've kind of been like the burr eliminator. So it's odd behavior that I haven't seen before. So after a couple of sharpenings, I've gotten the apex of the edge to stabilize and whittle hair directly off of the stone. But that just goes to show you that there was some fatigued and overheated steel there at the very apex of the edge from, you know, all that material that was hogged off during the factory sharpening. I mean, this is pretty common on production knives. Typically, I buy the Spydercos in high-speed steels, which, of course, with the molybdenum in there, they have a higher temper resistance, and they're typically tempered, you know, 1,000 to 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, so they're much more resistant to heat during the sharpening process. My guess would be this has a modified low temperature temper. And the hardness that Sean recorded on his was 65 HRC. So it's a nice knife and a nice steel that's now got a really nice grind. If we can look at it from the spine, see how acute that tip is. Having trouble focusing on it. Of course, I crowned the spine. If you look at the back of that tip, it has this really cool sort of a smoky, hazy finish, which you have to completely mirror polish it before you do that. Added a very, very tiny sharpening notch, you know, just enough so that I can fully apex the edge at the heel and get in there and get it sharp all the way to the back. Also did some sort of ghost mods inside, lapped the blade tang and the pivot washers to make it a whole lot smoother. So the knife is almost horizontal right now. But if I depress the lock, very, very smooth. Let's look at that blade centering. I mean, it's perfectly centered. Also rounded the edges of the G10 handle scales. So now that it's reground and resharpened and I've got the edge stabilized, I mean, I'm really happy with it. It's a nice knife. Now, I understand why Spyderco doesn't grind this thin. I brought a kitchen knife I recently found to show you. So this is 1/8 thou at the shoulder of the edge bevel. Basically the same thickness as the primary grind on that now. And see all that rippling? So basically something was cut that shouldn't be cut, and the yield strength of this steel was exceeded, causing plastic deformation. And now to fix this, I'd probably grind a good bit off the edge and then do a regrind. The tip on this one's about 15 thou, so it's actually thicker than the tip on the Spyderco. This is why Spyderco doesn't do those super lean grinds very often, because they're much more susceptible to damage. It's not cheap to do a grind like this either. You go through a lot of money in abrasives, and you go through a lot of time, because you can't just shove the blade into the belt as hard as you want, because you're going to overheat the edge. I've been doing this for quite a while, I know. This now is definitely the kind of knife that you would not hand to somebody else to use. And I reground it back around Christmas time, so I've been carrying and using it for about a month now. Quite happy with the finished product. So there it is. Appreciate y'all watching. If you're interested in me going over my experience with working with and grinding CPM 15V, let me know. Otherwise, I will catch you next time.